of our 2000.
Complex given the relatively small amount of halibut that we have in Area 2A. It has 12 different allocations that includes the treaty tribes, non-Indian sport, and commercial fisheries that in some cases treat each of the 3 states separately, along with some incidental bycatch allowances in our salmon troll fishery and our sablefish fishery north of Grays Harbor. This year's changes I consider to be refinements to our 2016 catch sharing plan, and again are described in detail in a recent letter sent to Dr. David Wilson from our Council Executive Director Chuck Tracy. I hope you will favorably consider the plan that we have presented when it comes time for you to take that action. Looking ahead, we will be reviewing our catch sharing plan with a focus on the allocation elements between the states. To assist in that review, the Council asked for help from the IPHC staff, and that request came via a letter dated July 29, 2016. We received a response from Dr. Lehman back on August 18th, in which he agreed to assist us by providing us several pieces of information by our June 2017 meeting, and those 2 pieces included survey data from Area 2A organized by state boundaries and results from a new spatial temporal model. And I want to say we acknowledge the cautionary caveats that were expressed in the letter relative to the use of that data. Regarding bycatch mortality, our trawl catch sharing plan, or our individual quota program, is undergoing a comprehensive 5-year review. We are confident that the dramatic reductions in halibut bycatch mortality that occurred beginning with that program in 2011 will be maintained over the long term. And just as a reminder, in our groundfish trawl fishery, we had bycatch mortalities ranging from 300,000 to 500,000 tons, and in the last 3 years, it has been 43, 55, and 55 tons respectively. I do have a couple of comments relative to the 2A set line survey as a result of the discussion that occurred at yesterday's commission open session. We understood that there was an intent to increase the number of stations in the northern part of California to I think establish the southern extent of the Pacific halibut. While we don't necessarily disagree or object to that occurring, we are also mindful of I think the word that's been used, the patchiness of halibut off Washington and Oregon and California, and we would also like some consideration of increasing the density of the survey in the northern portion of 2A, and that was discussed a little bit, I believe, by the Commission yesterday. We understand that if there was an increase in the number of stations due to an increase in the density, that we also have to be mindful of the yellow eye impacts that would occur with additional stations in the north. Finally, relative to the 2017 commercial fishery, Area 2A commercial and treaty Indian fisheries will fall within the adopted IPHC fishery season dates. And second, for the non-Indian commercial fishery, in 2A. We anticipate a series of 10-hour periods for the directed fishery starting the last Wednesday in June, with potential additional openers at 2-week intervals depending on the attainment of quota. I am happy to answer any questions that you may have and appreciate the opportunity to come before you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Any questions for Phil? Jim?
Thanks, Phil, for the report. That's very helpful. So you mentioned briefly the survey station deployment. Last night in the U.S. section meeting, we had some public testimony that thought that those stations would not be particularly useful. You said you don't oppose them, but I'm wondering if you have a thought whether there are more, their utility relative to the increased density up north, which have also warned us about because of incidental species. But we haven't got to the point where we're approving the surveys yet. Typically, we want to rely on the scientific staff to do that, but just if you have an input on that.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Bolsinger. I think if you'll look at the results of the survey stations in the southern extent that is currently being done, you will see that there have been no halibut taken in the last 2 years, I believe. And so adding additional stations to the south of those areas where we have experienced no catch, at least in in the last 2 years that survey was done, seems like the cost-benefit ratio of having multiple additional stations south of there is questionable. And if there were additional financial resources to add additional stations in 2A, it seems to me it would be better to make those investments in the areas where the density is greater and that we have anecdotal, at least, input from people such as me, that the 10-mile grid that's being used there now may not have the sufficient density to truly capture the abundance of halibut in 2A.
Thanks, Jim. Any other questions? Phil, I had one about, you also mentioned need to consider yellow eye rockfish, and so I didn't know if you wanted to expand upon that.
Well, yellow eye rockfish were overfished and are subject to a rebuilding plan under the provisions of the Pacific Fishery Management Council's Ground Fish Management Plan. And we have a small amount of yellow eye that are available. It's fully non-retention of yellow eye, so it's simply mortalities. We've taken extraordinary measures, particularly, well, both in our commercial fishery where we've pushed the fixed gear fleet outside 100 fathom. We've restricted our recreational fisheries in Washington, Oregon, and California extensively to stay away from yellow eye. And I may mess the number up, but I'll get it close. It's about 22 metric tons overall is the acceptable level of mortalities, and we are very close to that. So if we were to add survey stations in areas where yellow eye are typically found, we would have to make additional set-asides in our research category to ensure that we're accounting for those mortalities and staying within the overall lid or ceiling of mortalities that are in our rebuilding plan.
Thanks, Phil. Bob and Linda.
Phil, there's been a suggestion to perhaps add some stations between 100 and 150 fathoms. Would those have a de minimis impact on yellow eye relative to inside?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Alverson, I think that generally once you get outside of 100 fathom, the incidence of yellow eye will decline from then up on the shelf. I don't know that I could definitively say whether or not that would alleviate the issue, however.
The Pacific Council does minimize the impact from the commercial fleet, long-line fleet, by keeping them outside 100 fathoms off Washington State. Is that correct?
Now, you should have been listening to me Commissioner, because I specifically mentioned that you folks have been outside of 100 fathom to give due deference to your conservation contribution to yellow eye.
Linda.
This maybe isn't a question for Phil, but or a fair question for Phil. I'll ask it anyway. We're seeing increasing use of barotrauma release mechanisms in the sport fishery. I don't know sort of the determination in the fixed gear fishery is the fish may be on the hook too long for those to be useful in a commercial long line application, but potentially in a survey with shorter soak times. I just wondered whether that's an option to consider in minimizing impacts or whether that's already something in play in Washington.
Yes, go ahead, Phil.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for that question. Washington, Oregon, and California, all three Fish and Wildlife agencies, with great cooperation from the recreational fishing community, are extensively using devices to re-descend yellow eye rockfish. And as a matter of fact, and Ms. Summers may speak to that from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, they're considering a regulation requiring that, and Ms. Culver may speak to that too. So we are real believers in those devices, and I think that the opportunity to use those in the survey or even perhaps in the commercial fishery ought to be carefully looked at and seriously considered.
Phil, did you have a particular proposal on the expansion in 2A?
I'm sorry.
You were talking about expansion of the set line survey. Sorry.
No, I don't have a specific proposal. I think my general message is that if there is additional investment to be made in the survey of halibut in 2A, we think that, I think that it would be better used to increase density of grids in the areas to the north of 2A, where the probability of getting additional useful information is much higher than surveying down in an area where the chances of catching any, really improving our understanding is much less.
Okay.
But I would leave it up to the experts as to how to do that.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Thank you very much.
There's no further questions for Phil. I'm going to move on. I think Gretchen is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've already had the privilege of working with several of you that I see around in this room and at this table. For those of you who don't know me, a real brief introduction. My name is Gretchen Hanshew. I work at NIMP's West Coast region in the Seattle office. I've been with the region since 2002 and have worked ensconced in the Pacific Council process with groundfish for over 10 years. I'm very excited and honored to be here today to speak with you and look forward to working with you all. This afternoon I'm going to be presenting the report on 2016 Pacific halibut fisheries in Area 2A. You can find this online. It is Agency Report 02. It's a 7-page report, and you can see projected here the summary table on page 7. Our best estimates of catch total for Area 2A out of the 1.14 million pound quota has actually been updated since publication of this table with treaty Indian ceremonial and subsistence values just last week, and updating the total that you see in this next to last column here on the right side, and I will just give those to you, the updated totals The updated total catch in pounds is 1.139 million pounds, which is 99.9% of the total allocation for 2A. As you'll see in the summary table, if you look, the summary totals for commercial fisheries were, generally speaking, were below their allocations that come out of the 2A catch sharing plan. The Washington sport fishery total was above their amount, and Oregon and California came in at or below their allocations. A further breakdown of Washington, Oregon, and California sport fishing catches are shown below. And also at the top of this table, you will see the description of tribal Indian fisheries and those summaries. Both the Indian fishery and sport fishery totals, additional details will be presented by state and tribal staff, so I won't go into additional details on those. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that I can on this 2A summary, and feel free to come introduce yourself to me at breaks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gretchen. I'll just see if there's any questions for you. Gretchen, I just had one on the sport fishery. I see that the Washington sport fishery was a little bit over its share, and I'm just wondering what transpired there.
Majority of this overage came from inside waters in Puget Sound, and as mentioned in the report from the Pacific Council that Phil just presented, Puget Sound is exploring further in-season monitoring and management regimes for the inside waters in 2017 that I think will help mitigate against this happening in the future. As far as the details of what transpired and led to these higher than anticipated catches, I'm going to let Washington staff speak to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Are there no further questions? No. Rob Jones. Rob, you're with the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, I believe?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. There's not a written report on the treaty tribal fisheries in your briefing materials. However, a lot of this detail is contained in NOAA Fisheries 2A summary report. Within the catch sharing plan that Phil mentions, there is nested within that an adjudicated court-ordered intertribal management plan for the 35% that's allocated to treaty Indian fisheries. That divides that set aside into three portions. The first is called the unrestricted fishery, and that's a derby style fishery. The second is a restricted or trip limit fishery, generally targeting 500 pounds per vessel per day. And the third portion is the late season fishery. And depending on what's available in terms of quota to that, that can either be a trip limit or a derby style fishery. This year the treaty allocation was 365,100 pounds after accounting for ceremonial and subsistence catch, which is estimated from the year prior and removed from the total allocation to get to the commercial set aside. The unrestricted fishery began on the international opening for some of the tribes. However, there are also weather criteria that are associated with that opener, and for some tribes the weather was too severe to open on March 19th, and for other tribes they felt that their fleets were prepared to go out. So 2 tribes opened on March 19th for 39 hours. The inside tribes opened on March 20th for 39 hours. And finally, the Quinault tribe, which is to the south and had different weather patterns, opened on the 21st, again for 39 hours. I should point out that unrestricted fishery was reduced from what in the past has been a 48-hour opener to the 39-hour opener in recognition of increasing catch per unit effort and an attempt to stay within their subquota within that management plan that I mentioned. The restricted fishery opened April 1st for 28 hours, so it was just over a 1-day opener with a 500-pound per vessel limit. That took a little over 50,000 pounds. I should have mentioned that the unrestricted took close to 240,000 pounds. The exact numbers again are in your NOAA report. And finally, the late season fishery had 3 openers. The first was an 800-pound limit per vessel per day, and that was a 1-day opener on May 1st. There was an agreement among the tribes to gift 3,000 pounds of the tack to the host tribe for the canoe journey that year. The remainder was then divided among the halibut tribes, with each getting an allocation of 1,207 to be taken between May 18th and August 15th. There was a little bit remaining after that, and so the additional was taken, with each tribe getting just over 400 pounds to be taken prior to November 7th. And when all was said and done, the total tribal commercial catch was 360,075, so about 5,000 pounds short of the overall TAC. And that was, I think, in large part what we heard from fishermen was it wasn't economical as we got later in the season with those smaller trip limits. I referenced the catch per unit effort, and just briefly I'll note that we've seen a slight increase among all treaty fleets of between 22 and 23 in 2013, up to 23.6 in 2014, 23.1 in 2015, up to 30.3 in 2016, and that's been driven by particularly the treaty tribes out in the ocean that tend to have larger fleets and catch the majority of the halibut fishery, particularly in the unrestricted fishery. And that's gone from 54 pounds per vessel per hour on average in 2014 up to 70.98 in 2015, and then up to 96.84. So that's again to emphasize the increasing catch of halibut in the unrestricted fishery. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks very much, Rob. Any questions for Rob? Linda?
Thank you. Rob, I did want to hear your perspective on how, I know there was a meeting between you and the staff, and one of the discussions I understood that needed to take place was how catch per unit effort was handled from openings that were trip limit openings as opposed to a derby opening. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how that should be handled and how it is being handled at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Benkin, we have not had that meeting yet. I've had some brief side conversations with Ian, and we need to have additional dialogue around how to consider logbook information from the unrestricted fishery compared to those trip limit fisheries, which are often different fishermen fishing a very different way.
Yeah, go ahead, Jake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I have a question more out of curiosity. I believe that most of our data and information we collect through the surveys and our weight per unit effort and our CPUE is done per skate. And you just mentioned, you know, not that I'm doubting your figures at all, but that you were doing it per hour and your rate of catch. And I was quite curious why that was and what the rationale is behind it.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. I'm sorry.
Jake Vanderhyde.
Thank you, Mr. Vanderhyde. We manage the fishery in hours, and different tribes have different regulations on the number of skates that are allowed in order to control effort within their own fleets. And furthermore, the information that the Commission collects to help the tribes with this intertribal in-season management is on that per hour basis, and so it's not on a per skate basis.
Thank you for the clarification.
Rob, can I ask how many people typically do go fishing for halibut from the tribes?
You can ask me that, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, but there are 13 treaty halibut tribes with various levels of effort, and I can collect that information shortly and get it to you if that's of interest. But it's several hundreds.
Several hundreds. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good enough. I just was wondering sort of what sort of level of effort. Appreciate that. If there's no further questions for Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I believe the next report is going to be from Michelle Culver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Michelle Culver with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I will be referring to Agency Report number 5 for your reference. And probably want to just look at the first on page 1, the next page, yes. So for your reference, there's a summary there in Table 1 of what our sub-area quotas were for our recreational halibut fisheries as described in the Pacific Council's catch sharing plan. Then the next column over represents what the catch was in those respective sub-areas and the average weight for those areas collected by our port samplers and the season dates that each of those areas were open. In response to Commissioner Rael's question about the overage in our sport fisheries combined, by far that's primarily attributed to the Puget Sound fishery, which had an overage of about 79% of its quota. So 102,699 pounds compared to its quota of 57,393 pounds. So we reported to you over the last, reported to you over the last couple of years a couple of concerns that we had relative to our catch estimation method for our Puget Sound fishery, which was the only fishery that we would set season dates pre-season, anticipating what the catch would be for those days, and then adjusting subsequent seasons based on the previous year's average catch. So the season lengths in Puget Sound have steadily declined over the last 10 years, going from something that was over 20 days long to 8 days long. And you'll see in 2016, even with a fishery that lasted 8 days, they still came in considerably over their quota. We did receive a NOAA grant that we were able to employ in 2015 and expand in 2016 that allowed us to do some overflights throughout Puget Sound, do some real-time boat counts for effort estimates, and produce more real-time catch information for that fishery. We plan to repeat that methodology in 2017 for our primary catch areas within Puget Sound, which would allow us to do some in-season quota monitoring and close the fishery upon projected quota attainment. So whereas the season has been about 8 days long for the last couple of years, we're anticipating with the in-season quota monitoring program, the season would be something like 5 or 6 days long in 2017. Also described further in our report is the number of halibut that are caught in Canada and landed in Neah Bay. So in 2016, that was 304 halibut. We don't collect the average weight for those fish independently, so we typically would apply the average weight we see in our North Coast fishery, which is listed there at 18.88 pounds. So doing so produces a catch estimate of 5,740 pounds of fish caught in Canadian waters and landed in Neah Bay. Then finally, at the very end of our report, we've attached a report of our enforcement efforts, and the very last page summarizes that we had a total of just under 2,100 contacts, 223 in the commercial fishery, 1,872 recreational contacts, resulting in 121 warnings and 103 citations that were issued. So with that, be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Linda?
Thanks. I'm sorry if I didn't find this in the report yet, but can you tell me the nature of the citations?
Sure, thanks. The citations vary, but they're primarily, we have a very large closed area for our recreational fishery off the coast of the North Coast area. And so they could be for fishing in the closed area, retention of prohibited rockfish species, for example, or over limit on their catches. That's typically the nature of the citations. Thank you.
Yeah, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. One following up on that, is something like a 5% violation rate of those contacts, I think. So is that similar to other years? Do you have any information on that?
I did not go through and compare that, but I could produce that if desired.
All of these pictures, are those of violations, or are some of the fish enforcement guys just having a good time?
Thanks. No, those are all of violations.
Thank you. And if I could, one more question. I appreciate the fact that your report is factual and absent any emotion, but it doesn't suggest that the fishery was short because the fishermen are getting smarter, or do you have a feeling that there's more fish out there than have been attributed to the area by, or is there any department ideas on that?
Sure, thanks. We have seen a steady increase in effort in the fishery, and so we do have a daily catch limit of 1 fish per angler, and so our CPUE has been relatively steady. It's very close to achieving that one fish per angler, and what we have seen is an increase in effort participation in the fishery, and that has resulted in increased catch.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Michelle, you mentioned in the North or Puget Sound area the collapse of the fishery in terms of days. I assume that the percentage that was allocated to that area has stayed static, and could you verify that?
Yes, thank you. The catch sharing plan that was developed by the Pacific Council, I think it was first developed back in 1988, and then it was further refined back in 2000, and the allocations for our sport fishery have remained static throughout that time frame. And as the way the catch sharing plan is designed, the Washington sport subquotas have remained relatively the same for about the last 5 years or so. So as we've seen the decline in the number of days to achieve the quota in Puget Sound, the quota has remained the same over that time period.
And on Jim's question, the success rate, even though there's more participants fishing, I assume that you're seeing that across the Puget Sound, North Coast, and South Coast, all the areas you're seeing that?
Yes, that's correct. So it's not unique to Puget Sound. The difference is that the areas on the coast are real-time quota monitored, and so their seasons have also been getting shorter each year with this increase in effort that we've seen, but we're able to take in-season action and close them when their quota is attained.
Michelle, maybe you've already said this, so the bag limit is 1 for the recreational fishery. Is there a size limit as well?
There is no size limit. We did have a size limit in place of the 32 inches for some time, but we removed that several years ago, so no size limit.
So with increasing effort and reducing the number of days down to 8, or are you thinking that there's other tools that you may be looking at besides just days?
Yes, thanks. We're certainly open to exploring other tools. One of the things that we have noted in the last couple of years, and especially in 2016, is we've had a growing participation, particularly by our private boat fleet, and we have noted that there are quite a few private boats that will fish multiple areas. So they will fish in Puget Sound, then they'll fish off of Westport, fish off of Neah Bay, and we've always had staggered season dates, which allows an angler to move to multiple areas and take advantage of when that particular area is open. So one of the things that we are trying for the first time in 2017 is having one statewide season that applies to all areas, which would make the angler choose which area they're going to fish. We're hoping that will help add some opportunity in all of the areas as that choice is made. So we first want to see how that works out, the statewide season, before we look at other things like a size limit.
Do you and Washington State have a recreational advisory process, or is that all, does that all feed into the council?
Thanks. Yes, we do have a recreational advisory process. Each of the 3 states has their own process, and then we collect information through those state stakeholder processes and report them through the council on an annual basis. So Washington Fish and Wildlife has a recreational halibut advisory group, and and we have public meetings that are open to all stakeholders. We don't limit participation.
All right. Thanks very much. If there's no other questions for you, thanks, Michelle. I think next we're going to hear from Maggie Somner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Director Wilson, and staff. I'm a new face here. Let me introduce myself. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where I'm our Marine Fisheries Manager. I have been with ODFW since 2004, but working mostly with ground fish and some other conservation policy issues. So this is my first foray into halibut, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I will be summarizing report AR06, ODFW's report, just to give you a little bit of detail on how our fisheries went in 2016. Starting with our recreational fisheries, the Oregon recreational fishery receives 20% of the 2A TAC based on the catch sharing plan. This was 220,077 pounds. And to get right to the bottom line, as I believe you heard in Gretchen's report also, total recreational catch in Oregon was at about 95% of our allocation, which was, the total catch was 208,935 pounds. This was an estimated 11,147 fish, averaging 18.7 pounds net weight. 18.7 was a 7% increase in average weight compared to 2015. The average weight has ranged from 17 to 19 pounds since 2010, with a slightly increasing trend over this time. Approximately 21,000 recreational halibut angler trips contributed $2.5 million to Oregon's coastal communities via spending on trip and fishing-related expenses. We've seen a trend of increasing angler effort in our recreational halibut and groundfish fisheries in recent years, while halibut catch per angler trip has remained steady at 0.5 to 0.6 fish per angler trip. These catch and effort estimates were made in the same manner as we have in previous years using data from our Ocean Recreational Boat Survey, which is a dockside sampling program covering our charter and private fleets. Pardon me. And statewide, we sampled 3,578 halibut in 2016, which was 33% of the total estimated landed halibut. Just a few sentences on each of our sub-areas and fisheries to give you a flavor for those. Our recreational allocation is shared across 3 sub-areas. 2.3% goes to the Columbia River sub-area, which is shared with Washington and is from Ledbetter Point, Washington to Cape Falcon, Oregon. 93.79% goes to the Central Oregon Coast sub-area from Cape Falcon to Humbug Mountain, and 3.91% to the Southern Oregon sub-area from Humbug Mountain to the Oregon-California border. Table 1 on page 5 in our report shows some area-specific catch, sample, and average weight numbers. In the Columbia River sub-area in 2016, we had an all-depth season beginning in May, open 4 days per week, and a nearshore fishery open 3 days per week. After less than a month, on June 3rd, the all-depth season closed with a total of 11,896 pounds caught, which was 1,387 pounds over the allocation. This overage was greater than what had been set aside for the nearshore season, therefore the nearshore season was also closed at that time, with no effort or landings having occurred yet in the nearshore fishery. In the Central Coast sub-area, which was allocated 206,410 pounds last year, we have a shallow nearshore fishery and an all-depth fishery. In the nearshore fishery, the initial allocation last year was 24,769 pounds. In September, this fishery was projected to reach its quota early, while other Oregon recreational halibut fisheries were not projected to take their entire allocations before scheduled closure dates. Therefore, we transferred some poundage from the summer all-depth season and from the Southern Oregon sub-area and kept the Central Coast nearshore fishery open through the full season until October 31st, with a total catch of 32,132 pounds. This was 2% under the adjusted allocation. The all-depth fishery in the Central Coast subarea receives 88% of that subarea's quota and is by far the largest recreational halibut fishery in Oregon. It's split into a spring season starting in May with an allocation of 130,038 pounds last year and a summer season with 51,603 pounds. The spring all-depth season begins with a series of fixed open dates in May with a number of Thursday, Friday, and Saturday openings set pre-season to allow anglers to plan fishing in advance. Any remaining poundage is available for pre-scheduled make-up open dates after that time. Last year, the spring all-depth fishery was open for 12 fixed days only, no backup dates. We had a mix of excellent conditions and extremely high effort, and some marginal conditions with lower effort in the spring all-depth fishery. Total catch in that season was 132,097 pounds. This was just slightly over the spring all-depth catch limit, and that overage was deducted from our summer all-depth fisheries allocation to balance it out. Our summer all-depth fishery begins in early August with every other Friday and Saturday open. For only the second time since 2005, the summer all-depth fishery remained open all the way to the scheduled closure date of October 31st. We saw some unusually poor ocean conditions with very high winds and some wave and current conditions, limiting effort and catches during the early part of the summer season this year. And then after Labor Day, it is normal that effort declines steadily as many anglers switch to hunting and go on to school and other things. Total catch in the summer fishery last year was 38,423 pounds, which was 10% under the revised summer fishery catch limit. Overall, from our nearshore and all-depth fisheries in the Central Coast subarea, we caught a total of 202,651 pounds. This is 98.2% of that subarea's allocation. And our third subarea in Southern Oregon receives a small amount, 3.91% of our recreational allocation. This was 8,605 pounds in 2016. Last year, anglers had little success in the early season compared to 2010 to 2013 when effort and catch really ramped up in this area. In the last couple years, we again have seen some very difficult ocean conditions down there, and in particular south of Cape Blanco on our south coast. We have a higher proportion of private anglers and small boats in the fleet, and we have some very difficult bars to cross to get out of the ocean, so they find weather conditions particularly limiting there. Effort and catch did pick up some in late July last year when salmon opportunities began to decrease, but catch projections remained well below the subarea's allocation, and as I mentioned earlier, we did shift some poundage from this subarea to the Central Coast nearshore season. The final catch estimate for the Southern Oregon subarea was 4,173 pounds, which was 55% of that subarea's allocation. On our commercial fishery, in Oregon, the commercial halibut fishery provides a relatively small amount of harvest revenue to a large number of participants, with a few vessels dependent on the fishery for a majority of their annual revenue. In addition to directed halibut fishing, we have a large number of salmon trollers who land halibut caught incidentally. Overall, in 2016, there were 230,000 round pounds of commercial halibut landings into Oregon at an ex-vessel value of $1.33 million. Halibut ex-vessel prices averaged $5.61 per pound round weight in 2016, which was slightly lower than the recent record high. There were a total of 148 unique vessels that had shoreside halibut landings in 2016. Oregon's harvest volume was 96% directed and 4% incidental. We also had 10 processors or buyers who purchased over $10,000 of landed halibut each in 2016. This comprised over 96% of all halibut landings into Oregon in the commercial fishery. At the end of our report, we did estimate the economic impacts of some of the proposed 2017 catch alternatives in the decision table in order to understand the trade-offs. You can see this in the online report. I can try to answer questions if you have any, but I don't plan to go into detail here. That concludes the ODFW report. You may have noticed that staff appended a summary from the Oregon State Police describing their halibut-related enforcement activities in 2016 to the ODFW report. So that's also there with some figures on the number of contacts made and some of a flavor for the types of violations, et cetera. And then finally, just to follow up on a few things that came up on yellow eye rockfish earlier, Phil mentioned that we have been working with our recreational angling public to encourage the use of descending devices when releasing yellow eye in recent years. Yellow eye are frequently encountered as bycatch in our halibut fishery as well as our bottomfish fishery. In December, our State Fish and Wildlife Commission adopted a requirement for descending devices in our groundfish fishery, and we plan to propose a similar requirement to them in state rule for our recreational halibut fisheries in April, and the reason we're doing them separately is only because of the timing of our state rulemaking processes for groundfish versus halibut. And I think with that I'll conclude and happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks Maggie. Any questions? Just on your last comment about the use of those descending devices, so is that in the commercial fishery? Is that what you're referring to when you say groundfish, or?
Just recreational.
Just recreational.
Mm-hmm.
And has there been any estimate of what that may do by instituting that management measure as far as, I guess, saving yellow eye rockfish?
We do. I don't have the numbers at the tips of my fingers, but we have developed a number of estimates on that, and the savings is fairly substantial. If I stall long enough, I should also acknowledge a lot of help from Lynn Mattis, a staff member who probably many of you who have been here a while are familiar with. Lynn is telling me that there's a 60 to 65% savings in yellow eye mortality. It varies by depth at which the yellow eye were caught and then released, but that figure would be the number of proportion of yellow eye that would be assumed to live when released with a descending device compared to released without one.
Mm-hmm. I noticed it was your figure 1, as you mentioned, where you have the yellow eye rockfish conservation area. Is that the only one in Oregon, or do you have others?
That is currently the only one in Oregon.
It looks like a small area on the map, but do you have any idea how big it is?
I'm afraid I don't off the top of my head. I would be happy to get back to you with that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not a small area, it's just that it looks small on the map.
It is a relatively small area. I can say we also just adopted some waypoints that give us the option of expanding that area in the Pacific Council process should we need it in season to further minimize yellow eye bycatch.
All right, thanks very much, Maggie. I don't see any other questions.
Thank you.
I think next we're going to hear from Greg Kashid, and you're with the U.S. Coast Guard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Lieutenant Commander Greg Kashid. I'm with the U.S. Coast Guard out of Seattle, and I am in the enforcement branch and also serve as the Coast Guard's representative to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to walk us through I believe it's agency report number 3. I'm just going to quickly walk through that and be happy to take any questions you may have. I'm here representing both District 13, which is Oregon and Washington, and also my colleagues down in District 11, which is California. For our resources, we have not seen any significant change from what you've seen reported to you in the past, so that's section 1. Happy to answer any questions you may have about that. As the Commission is fully aware, there were 3 commercial halibut derbies held this last year, in June 22nd, July 6th, and July 20th. In Area 2A, we conducted 28 boardings across those three derbies. And just to quickly reinforce what the Coast Guard's priorities are during those derbies, we want to make sure that the vessels are following whatever the pre-closure requirements are for hold inspections. We want to make sure that they are properly permitted to participate and ensure that their vessels have their permits on board. We're inspecting catch for compliance with size restrictions and overall catch limits. We're ensuring the fishing gear is also in compliance. And finally, we're ensuring vessels are not fishing after the derby closure if they have halibut on board. And of course, the Coast Guard's also very concerned about vessels meeting their safety requirements as well. For the 2016 halibut derbies, there was a mix of both our Coast Guard cutters, our small boats, and aircraft that patrolled for that. During the halibut derbies, the days of the halibut derbies, this is our top priority off the coast. We know that there are days when we're going to see a lot more vessels out on the water. And anytime you have a limited opportunity to catch something that's of value to the fishermen, there's also that safety aspect that comes into play with derby fisheries. So we take a lot of pride in making sure that we're ready and prepared for those and putting assets out there to respond should there be any issues. In 2016, there were no significant search and rescue cases that occurred during the season, so I'm very happy to report that for the Oregon, for the Area 2A section. I won't speak for my colleagues from Alaska. As you've heard from the state of Oregon and Washington, one of the areas that's a lot of people tend to think the Coast Guard and we think commercial fisheries, but we also work on the recreational side as well. Something that's important to us, anytime that you have those all-depth openers or anytime that the season shrinks, there's that concern that raises there, so we do focus on that. We do put our patrol boats out there during those openers and for the all depths, and then also for our small boat stations, having them being prepared to deal with that. There was only, there were no, in the halibut fishery, in the recreational side of the house, again, no significant cases that were directly related to an opening related to for the halibut fishery on the recreational side. In Section 4 of our report, you see the summary of violations and enforcement actions that were taken in 2016. I would note that during the 3 commercial derbies, there was only one incidence of what we would term as a significant violation. During a joint patrol with NOAA's Office of Law Enforcement, one of their enforcement officers, Coast Guards and them determined that a vessel was mutilating their catch, was retaining undersized halibut, and then also there were the concerns about destruction of evidence, and fish being released without, if my memory serves me correctly, being released back into the water so they couldn't be inspected. That case is, to the best of my knowledge, still being investigated by NOAA, so I would defer to them for any specifics about where that case resides currently. We also, during the dockside work, worked with NOAA to monitor the offloads when they came back into port. As I mentioned, and I would be remiss if I didn't state this, the Coast Guard remains concerned about the safety of derby-style fisheries. We have provided specific comment to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council over the years. To the extent that some of these concerns have been mitigated by looking at and using different tools to make determinations about when things open, that's very positive, and we're glad to see those tools being used to think about when a fishery is open and looking at the weather conditions that will be prevailing for the days of the derbies. So we appreciate that. It's just that anytime there's a derby fishery, it just raises that level of concern for us as an agency. And then finally, what I'll close with is enforcement requires partnerships. None of our agencies, whether it be the Coast Guard, the Fishery Services, the National Marine Fisheries Service, our partners at the state level or tribal partners, none of us have the resources to be able to go out and do it all together or do it all by ourselves. It takes us working together, strong partnerships, and we couldn't be more pleased with the partnerships we've had with both at the federal side, with our tribal partners, and also with our state partners. As we move forward, that's something we've seen as key to our success, and we intend to continue to do that in future years. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions from the Commission.
Thank you very much for your report. Are there any questions? Linda.
Thank you. This might be down in the weeds and not fair, but I'm just looking at Table 1 from your report, the distribution of boardings on vessels, and I see this big jump in 3A, number of boardings. And I wonder, do you have new personnel stationed out in that area, or what allowed that big increase in enforcement activity there?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will gladly defer that to my colleague from District 17, our Alaska region, who will be able to address that.
All right, we'll park that for now. Any other questions? No? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We do have one more presentation from 2A. It's with Jacqueline Carmison. She's with CDF&G Commission, I believe.
Good afternoon, honored commissioners, agencies, tribal leaders, staff, and stakeholders. Hello, my name is Jackie Hostler Carmison. I am the Vice President of the California Fish and Game Commission. It's my honor to be here today and to speak on behalf of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as the Fish and Game Commission. As you know, the Fish and Game Commission is the regulatory body for California Fish and Wildlife. The Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Game Commission work closely together to establish policy and manage sport fisheries. I live in McKinleyville, California, near the Oregon border, and I have some experience with the fishery, limited, but I also appreciate the role of policymakers in the decision-making process. I want to thank you for considering the proposed set line expansion further south into California in 2017. The Fish and Game Commission and the department continue to support efforts to assess the Pacific halibut stock off California and appreciate the IPHC looking at the new and expanded data streams. In 2014, the northern area was surveyed. 2015, the Pointe Arena area. 2016, California-Oregon border, and now the Monterey area in 2017. The Fish and Game Commission, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and California stakeholders look forward to working with the IPHC staff on survey plans and proposed stations. The Fish and Game Commission has been made aware of the escalating importance of halibut to the California North Coast communities. And as I said, I apologize, the Department of Fish and Wildlife staff, Marcy Uremko, was detained by storm. She was unable to fly out of LA, and so by default, I'm giving their report lightly touching on it, so if I can't answer questions, I'm happy to get back to you as well, or have Marcy get back to you. 2016 marked the second year of in-season quota tracking by the department. The process for estimating catches and determining a closure date in consultation with National Marine Fisheries and IPHC continue to work well to effectively keep catches to the quota. Final catches did slightly exceed the California quota by about 1,200 pounds, 104% of the 29,640 pound quota. So in our area 2A, we're 4% of the non-tribal share, excuse me, and the projections was 29,640 pounds. The estimate comes in at 30,893 pounds. The number of opening fish days in 2016 was more than in 2015. The California sport quota lasted 83 days between May and September. compared with only 57 open days in the 2015 fishery. However, anglers reported a substantial number of unfishable days during the scheduled open season. Many of these days were due to poor weather, and other days due to tidal flows and difficulties and almost impossible to cross the bar out of Eureka. Creel sampler records confirm that there was little to no effort for halibut on many of the open days in 2016. The fishery continues to be a very important target for Northern California coast anglers. In 2016, the Humboldt area saltwater anglers, who are here again this year participating in the conference, took a survey of their members who reported that halibut was extremely important to them as a fishery and second only to salmon. New in 2016, a total of 4 vessels participated in the West Coast directed commercial fishery in 2 of the open days. The preliminary landings were 1,002 net pounds and occurred from Crescent City to Eureka. In previous years, there has been very limited interest in the directed fishery. However, anecdotal information suggests some commercial fishermen re-examined this potential opportunity in 2016 as a result of recent success in the recreational fishery and the IPHC survey results in California waters in 2014 and 15. Reports suggest these fishermen were looking to augment their activities beyond typical commercial ground fish trips to determine if Pacific halibut could be successfully caught while abiding by the ground fish rockfish conservation area depth prohibition between 30 and 100 fathoms. When the commissioners have a chance, please check out the section in the California report on 2016 notables. This year, a halibut was sampled in the Creel census taken off of Santa Cruz, California, which is substantially further south than the bulk of the catch off California. Also, a fish in excess of 100 pounds was taken this year out of Shelter Cove. As part of my work on the Fish and Game Commission, I also wanted to share with you my commitment to work with federally recognized California tribes. And that is not just my commitment, but the commitment of all of the commissioners. We're working to memorialize a tribal committee through legislation. I've been on the California Fish and Game Commission since May of 2012. I was nominated because of my work with California tribes in the development of the North Coast Marine Protected Areas. While California tribes are not treaty tribes, there are certain areas within the state where the traditional and customary tribal activities involving natural resources are cultural and historic. An Indian tribe has the authority to regulate the off-reservation activities of its tribal members engaged in traditional and cultural activities within the tribe's ancestral territory. Within the framework of this tribal committee, we are beginning to explore co-management agreements. The tribes and the states will begin to work together to agree on protection goals relative to both the cultural and natural resources and the actions that would help achieve those goals. The Fish and Game Commission and the Department of Fish and Wildlife look forward to continuing to work with the Area 2A managers on catch sharing, evaluating stock distribution, and advancing the scientific knowledge base. We also support continued sustainable development of California's growing fishery, acknowledging that halibut played a significant role in historic Northern California fisheries, tribal traditional ecological knowledge and management since time immemorial, and recognizing that future halibut fishery opportunities might further benefit the communities and the people of the North Coast. So those are my comments as a commissioner, not so much into the weeds of the report. If you have any questions on the report, like I said, I'm happy to try and answer those while I'm here. And if not, I will get the experts.
All right. Thank you very much, Jackie. I'll just see if there's any questions for you. Bob.
So welcome this far north.
Thank you.
I'm looking at this figure 2, and it shows Crescent City, Trinidad, Eureka down to Shelter Cove, and which is kind of in the northern part where we've had our surveys before. But the expanded area goes down as far south as south of San Francisco Bay. Do you have any success or creel sampling or anything that suggests your people or your citizens are having success that far south?
I do not have the information with me today, but yes, I believe there is some information. There's a gentleman here representing Coastside Recreational Fishery, and I know that they have been gathering some data. I'm not sure why, but my report does not have figure 2 in it. Can someone scroll to the figure he's talking about?
I'm there.
Okay.
There it is.
So your question is, do we have sampling data from that area?
Not from that area. It looks like you're sampling that area. My question, I think we're looking at adding over 30 stations, and they're expensive, and we've heard mixed reports from some of the people from the public. And so I was wondering if you had something from the state of California that suggested in your sampling process that there had been some success.
I believe the department's position on it is that we don't have any data from that area, and that's why they're supportive of that. The other position that is not the department's position is that it could be detrimental if zeros are added into the averaging of the other surveys. So I've heard it both ways, and I don't know what the answer to that is, and that's one of my goals while I'm here, is to determine what is the better option. I know it's expensive, and I know, personally, because I live on the North Coast, I'd rather see more sampling in the North Coast area, but I do understand to get those lower areas surveyed is important as well. I just don't know what the answers are. I'm sure I didn't answer your question.
You did.
All right. I have a question. It's just what does the California Department Fish and Wildlife Commission do, and how does it relate to the actual Department of Fish and Wildlife?
Well, we're much like you as IPHC commissioners, and the department would be our staff.
Okay.
Yeah. We actually have commission staff, but the department is responsible for the the enforcement, the development of the regulations. We approve them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for really taking a look at 2A in Northern California, because we really feel like that we're left out and left behind. So I think you're going to hear more and more as the years advance about Northern California. There's a tremendous economic impact to Northern California, specifically because of the reduced fishing and because of the days that fishermen are not able to fish. And seeing that quota increase is really important to Northern California constituents.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jackie, and it's important to hear from each one of the areas about the importance of the fishery and how it does provide economic benefits to commercial, recreational, and why it is important to them. And
it's important to everyone, the tribes as well, so thank you very much.
So I think that is all of the reports for 2A, and now we're going to move on to 2B, and we have 3 people reporting. Adam, I think you're going to start with giving us the first report, and then followed by Neil, focused on the recreational fishery, and then Ann Bussell is going to close out with the enforcement report. So whenever you're ready, Adam.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much, Commissioner Ryle. So my name is Adam Kaiser. I work for Fisheries and Oceans Canada as the Halibut and Sablefish Coordinator with DFO in the Pacific region. Fisheries and Oceans Canada is responsible for managing, is the agency responsible for managing fisheries within Canada and safeguarding waters. For the report that I'm going to provide today, you all have a copy of the document. It's very similar to what's been provided in the past number of years. So I'm not going to go into all of the details, just a few highlights from some of the numbers, and then see if you have any questions that I can answer. So for the purpose of this report and management within Canada, we have the Canadian TAC, and it's defined as the FCEY that is negotiated here at the annual meeting. And the FCEY is our commercial and recreational catch, not including, at the time, recreational wastage. The Canadian TAC also includes carryover from the previous season of quota and food, social, ceremonial access provided to First Nations. The total value of the CTAC for the past season was £7.705 million. So within this number, there is a net carryover of negative 36,600 pounds. So a negative amount was carried forward from the previous year. The resulting commercial recreational TAC, so approximately the FCEY, was 7.24 million pounds. All of these values are in tables 1, 2, and 3 at the end of the report. An important point of note about that 7.24 million pounds, this catch limit is what is made available to all of our commercial fisheries, excluding trawl. So all landed mortality and all discard mortality that occurs from our commercial sablefish, halibut, rockfish, lingcod, dogfish fisheries must be accounted for within this 7 million pound limit. To that extent, these numbers are subject to change. For example, the sablefish fishery is still ongoing. Harvesters are compelled to discard their halibut, but they also must acquire quota for that discard mortality. So these numbers will continue to be updated until the commercial groundfish fishery season closes on February 20th. So that's it for the catch numbers. A couple of highlights from the past season. I think most folks know, but it's worth reiterating that all of our commercial groundfish fisheries are subject to 100% at sea and 100% dockside monitoring. The vast majority of hook and line vessels opt to use electronic monitoring, which is a system of cameras, GPS, and gear sensors to monitor all fishing activity, and that's compared against the logbook. At the dock, all fish are counted and weighed at the offload by a third-party service provider. To that extent, all of our commercial fisheries are also subject to individual transferable quotas for halibut and for a number of non-target species. Where this is particularly relevant for the halibut fishery is the existence of limited bycatch opportunities. Species like yelloweye, reductions in species like yelloweye have resulted in, I think, what I've heard anecdotally is changes in spatial distribution of fishing effort. Harvesters need to make sure that they stay away from choke point species like yelloweye and to some extent skate to meet their halibut catch. Despite this, all reports have been that it's a very good year for halibut fishing. Looking longer term, a couple of items that are worth noting is that the Canadian halibut fishery is just recently going through its Marine Stewardship Council recertification, and it's been a positive process, thanks in part to contributions from staff for the science components of the MSC process. And as I mentioned at the interim meeting, the Government of Canada has undertaken a number of initiatives with respect to marine protected areas or spatial closures. Broadly, these are called the Marine Conservation Targets, MCTs, and so this MCT work is ongoing. over the next 3 years. And they're proposing some pretty substantive closures on all 3 coasts of Canada. Details are still pretty sparse, but I expect there to be a number of announcements coming within the next few months. I'll leave it there for my report and see if there's any questions from the commissioners.
Any questions? Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Adam, in your first sentence, or I guess it's the second sentence, you make it clear that the quota 7.7 million net pounds fresh head off dressed weight. So we had a look this morning at our regulation that might require landings head on. So are they landed head off in Canada, or is that just the way
it's just
get back to that standard?
Yeah, it's just the conversion factor. I think when I looked last, 97% of catch in Canada, thereabouts, is landed head on.
Just a curiosity, appreciate it.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Adam? No?
Thanks for your time.
Very much. Over to you, Neil.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to provide a bit more detail on the recreational fishery. Most of the information provided to you by Adam was more focused on the commercial fishery. So I'll be just pointing out some of the highlights from the report that's in your, well, it's in your computers, I guess. Nobody looks at the paper anymore. And point to some of the things that you know, were specific to this year or that have changed, and then make a few comments at the end about what's planned for the coming year. So in 2016, the recreational total allowable catch for the recreational fishery was 1,100,950 pounds. Of that, we harvested 1,095,461 pounds. So that's about a 5,500 pound underage. The season opened on February 1st, closed on December 31st. One important note to come out of that is that with the season just closing as of the end of December, these numbers will continue to sort of be refined with the most up-to-date data. We expect that process to be finished in about the spring, and that's typical for each year. So our final numbers will be provided to the IPHC in the next few months. Very quickly, some of the management measures for this year, in order to manage the fishery within the limit, there was a maximum length of 133 centimeters of fish that could be retained. And there's also a daily and possession limit. So the daily limit is 1, possession limit is 2. So in addition to that maximum size limit, there is also a rule that says only one of your 2 fish in possession can be greater than 90 centimeters. So that's a slight change from the year previous where we had that same rule, but it was 83 centimeters instead of 90. So these are the kind of tweaks that get made through our consultative process with our Sport Fishing Advisory Board each year, where we do our best to forecast, given the TAC available to the fishery, what suite of management measures will be most effective in providing them with opportunity over the course of the season while still managing the fishery within its allowable catch. Other measures used this year, which are consistent with the last few years, were an annual limit of 6 per angler. So anglers were required to record each halibut that they caught and retained on their fishing license, and there's a condition in their license that requires them to do so. In terms of monitoring, there are a number of programs that we make use of to generate catch estimates. Most of them are going to be the same as you would have heard for previous years. The only thing that's new to this year, which is actually a fairly significant change and an improvement, I think, is that in addition to creel surveys and a number of different lodge and guide logbook programs that we've used for numerous years, we have implemented the use of an internet survey to basically round out our catch estimates in times and areas where we don't get a complete estimate through our traditional programs of creel and logbook. So the result of that is that we now have estimates that cover all months of the year in all of our fishery management areas that give us a more comprehensive estimate of catch. So this is a good thing. There was some work, this has been a number of years in the making. This internet survey has been sort of piloted since 2012. And really those years gave us a chance to calibrate the results coming out of that survey to what we feel is our most reliable way of estimating catch, which is the creel survey. So based on this, calibration between the two estimates, we take that calibration and apply the relationship in that calibration to the IREC estimates for the times and areas where we don't have creel surveys in order to generate the estimate of catch for that area. So this is part of our intention in terms of how we're going to generate catch estimates moving forward, is to continue to make use of this new tool in providing a more comprehensive catch estimate. In looking ahead, I'll just mention a few things quickly that might be worth noting. The first is that with additional years of this internet survey, we expect that we'll be able to kind of refine and better develop that relationship between our creel survey and our IREC survey, which we think will end up giving us better estimates of catch in areas. So that's something that we're continuing to build on. And the other thing I thought I'd mention, just given that a number of people have mentioned it before me, is that the use of descenders is also on the radar for the commercial, the recreational fishery in 2B. And it's relevant to the halibut fishery in that the focus around the use of descenders is rockfish. Rockfish are commonly bycaught when fishing for halibut in the rec fishery. And there's been some work to basically try and learn from our counterparts to the south who have been implementing the use of these as well as doing research on their efficacy. So I expect that as we go forward, this will be part of how we promote the recreational fishery to take place in 2B as we sort of formalize the way that we want to make use of descenders in the fishery and account for their use and so on. So I'll leave it there and invite any questions.
Thanks very much, Neil. Any questions for Neil? Linda?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a few questions around your sampling of catch and accounting for catch. And when you talk about creel surveys, is that for guided sport and unguided sport as a tool that you're using? And then also maybe you could talk about how many communities you have creel samplers in relative to points of landing. And last part of that, I guess, would be whether there's any access to lodges or remote lodges to sample, or if you're relying exclusively on logbooks from those locations.
Okay, so let me make sure I got all three there. So the first was about the creel survey.
Guided and unguided.
And guided versus unguided. And the second was, remind me?
The communities that you're, where the creel census takes place, how extensive it is relative to points of landing, and then
the third was remote lodges, and is
yes,
just
and do you have access to those lodges, and are they being creel censused?
Okay, so on the first question, I think 2B is somewhat different than 2C and 3A in that there isn't a formal distinction between guided and unguided with respect to the way the fishery is managed and monitored. So our creel surveys would document any boats passing through the point of contact, the marina or the port where the creel survey is occurring, regardless of whether they were guided or unguided. I don't believe at present the creel survey is gathering information about the proportion of boats or anglers that are guided versus unguided. That's not part of the data set that's collected. It has been something that, you know, people ask about, but at this point in time, we're not collecting information to kind of survey on that question. On your second question, where does the creel survey? So Table 7 in this report will give you an outline of where the creel takes place by month and area. So in the first column, there's a list of Pacific fishery management areas, and these reflect different parts of the coast. The cells to the right give you a sense of, or are shaded in blue or are just clear. The clear cells are where the creel is taking place, or some other traditional lodge or logbook program. So the creel essentially, the way that creel resources are allocated is a reflection of sort of given the resources available, where is most of the catch occurring, and there's a prioritization exercise that occurs each year. It isn't just accounting for halibut, it also needs to take into account other kind of main focal species for the recreational fishery. I believe the other key species is Chinook. Paul may be able to add more on that, given some of his background. So there's a bit of you know, a trade-off and a calculation of, you know, both of those priorities. In other words, it's not just halibut driving where the creel occurs, and it's focused on the times and months. The times and areas where the bulk of the catch is thought to be occurring. So the third question was more about how do we get information from remote lodges. The main tool that's used is the lodge logbook program. However, there is also work done by our enforcement staff to audit the reports that are coming out of lodges, and actually I think just within the last day or two, and Ann Bussell, who's going to give you the next report from our conservation and protection staff, can speak more to this, but I think we just had a conviction of a lodge in Haida Gwaii for contravening some of the recreational daily and possession limits. So there is that takes place. In some of the areas, although the lodges are remote, there also are creel surveys. So a good example of that is parts of Haida Gwaii. So the majority of the recreational fishing effort, I think it's safe to say, occurs through lodges, but there are also creel surveys that are established at kind of key ports and points of entry and exit for some of the recreational fishing effort there. So it's a bit of a mix. It depends really on the specific area of the coast in terms of what tools we're using to monitor catch.
Just follow up, I guess I'm not quite understanding who has to do logbooks, and is everybody doing logbooks, and everybody within the boundaries of what you described part of the creel census, or is logbooks just for lodges, or where does the logbook come in?
I see, okay. So when it comes to halibut, I guess the first thing to maybe reiterate is that any angler, regardless of lodge, guided, unguided, is required by the conditions of their license to record their catch of halibut on their license. And there's a condition of their license that also says if they're asked, they need to provide their catch information to the department or, you know, an associated official. So in that respect, although it's not quite a logbook, everyone is required to record their catch for halibut on their license. The logbook programs are not specific to halibut. They may be reporting on a number of different species. They are most well established in areas where creels are less well established. So the best example of that would be on the Central Coast, where recreational fishing is more limited. The area is very remote. So there's not a lot of effort there, but there are a handful of lodges. And so the primary tool used there is lodges being required to submit logbooks. But that's not necessarily the case everywhere, given that in other places there are other programs that we use instead of logbooks.
Maybe just add a couple of things to what Neil talked about as well. So this figure up here, we call a heat map. Quite often it's colored red. So anyhow, it's based upon where the effort and halibut, as Neil spoke, but also Chinook. And so where we see, you know, a lot of fishing, a lot of effort, that's where we expend our resources. And then when we run out of resources, well, we then look at the other method that Neil spoke about with the survey. And now that we have everyone pretty much getting their light recreational licenses online, so we have the ability to select randomly from about 300,000 licenses. They provide that information, and there's the calibration that Neil spoke about. One of the other things that we are looking at as well, we've been working with in partnership with the Sport Fishing Institute as well as the Pacific Salmon Foundation to develop what we call a Fisher app. And there's a number of apps that people get on their smartphones here in the U.S. and other places. So we're developing this one, and the first thing that it's going to provide is information back out to the recreational community about what the regulations are, so they can pull up their phone and they're somewhere, and so what are the regulations? And because they're constantly, well, some of them are changing quite a bit, Chinook being one. So they're quite confusing, and if you have the app, then there's better communication rather than just coming to our website, which is very confusing. So the intent was to get all this information out, but the other part of that development meant we in DFO had to put some rigor about how we are communicating and creating. So what happened is we created this database, if you will, that takes all those regulations and updates our website automatically rather than manually. And similarly, it pushes information out to the Fisher app. We do think likely going into down the road, another iteration of this app would be getting information back. And that could be around a logbook. That would be a requirement for some species, maybe, and that would get information back. So it's going both ways, information out, but information back. And I guess the first iteration of this application will be put out next month, this timeline. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
I'm not sure, Neil or Paul, but do you have a sense what percentage of your halibut catch in the sport fishery is the creel census is applied to? 80% of the catch? Do you know what?
Oh, well, I don't know, but we could. It's something we could
pull out of the data.
Pull out. Yep. Just glancing at this, you can immediately get sort of a general sense. You know, you see the cells in blue; those are covered by our internet survey. And most of them are much smaller numbers than the numbers that are covered by our creel programs, which are all in the white cells.
And but this is not just halibut.
That's
okay.
Well, no, this is just halibut. But what I was going to add is that the numbers in the white cells, in some cases, are a combination of creel surveys plus these logbook programs. So that's where we would have to do a bit of work to kind of separate them in order to give you a more definitive answer. Because going back to your previous question about, so where do the lodge logbooks apply? The short answer is that in some areas, we're getting all our estimates through a creel. In some areas, it may be a combination, and in some areas, it may be entirely logbook based. Okay. So it's a mix. But if it's something you're interested in, I think we could give you a breakdown.
Great, if it's easy, that would be nice to have. Thank you.
Yeah, Jim.
Thank you. But for example, in July in Fish Management Area 1, that doesn't mean that you looked at that the creel census person handled 3,200 fish, or does it mean that?
How do you mean?
Well, in Fish Management Area 1, just take a month. In July, it says 3,200. What does 3,200 mean?
3,200 is the number of pieces that are estimated for that month and area.
But they didn't say 3,200.
So in order to answer that, I would need to go back and dig into the details of, okay, for PFMA number 1 in July, is our estimate entirely based on creel, or is it a combination of two sources? even if it is entirely based on creel, that does not mean they handled or touched 3,200 fish, because what they're doing is taking a sample and then combining it with aerial surveys that give us an effort estimate and extrapolating or expanding the sample based on the effort that's gathered from the aerial survey. So the number is a reflection of a creel sample plus this aerial survey to generate a month and area estimate as a whole.
Thank you very much.
All right. I don't think there's any more questions. Thanks, Neil. So the next report is from Ann Bussell around enforcement.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. My name is Ann Bussell. I'm the Regional Groundfish Enforcement Coordinator for the Pacific region of Canada. I will present the 2016 Halibut Fishery Enforcement Report, and I will summarize it for you. To start with, in 2016, our priorities were closed area fishing, issues with the electronic monitoring system, for instance, time gaps, failures not reported, dual fishing. And dual fishing is where a commercially licensed vessel may fish for halibut both with the commercial license and also with a communal fishing license for food, social, and some ceremonial purposes. As well, priorities were hails in and out and obstruction of our dockside observers and false and misleading information. These priorities will remain the same for 2017. And I will summarize occurrences, violations, and enforcement effort hours in 2016. And I will remind everybody that occurrences aren't necessarily violations. So the numbers might seem high in some of the fisheries, and I can explain that further. So for our Aboriginal halibut fisheries, there were 23 occurrences in 2016, and of those 6 violations, there were 481.25 enforcement hours spent on those fisheries. The majority of problems were in the illegal buy, sell, possess area. In our commercial halibut fisheries, there were 141 occurrences. Of those 27 violations, they involved dual fishing and seabird avoidance gear not being deployed. There were 1,297.5 hours spent in that fishery. In the recreational halibut fishery, there were 63 occurrences reported, 51 violations, and 445 enforcement hours. The majority of the violations involved reporting, so as was explained by Neil, recording the halibut on their recreational license. And the recent conviction of the lodge in Haida Gwaii, that came down I just learned about it today actually. I was aware of the investigation. So there were 6 counts they were convicted on, and it involved halibut and salmon. So for the halibut, there were 28 fillets and 38 whole halibut in their possession. So the possession was the main violation there, and we obtained a $35,000 fine from the courts. So this is really good precedence for us. Our fishery officers up in Haida Gwaii do a number of inspections of the lodges there per year. Usually at the start of the year they will go and do a bit of education, and then they will do some various inspections throughout the year that are where they don't give the lodge notification ahead of time to see what's really going on. And a couple of our programs that I mentioned last year, one is our surveillance plane. We have approval this year to have a permanent team of 3 fishery officers in place, which I think will be even more effective, because when they're on permanently, they really get a good idea of the coast. We try and fly the entire coast every week with one officer on board, and the plane has really sophisticated equipment, so videos, photographs, all sorts of things can be taken with that plane, and officers can follow up with investigations as violations are found. As well, our two Coast Guard vessels are in full operation. One has started again. They are in the dry docks for about 6 to 8 weeks a year during December, January. So our North Coast vessel is now out again, and I get reports every day on what they're seeing, what they're doing. So they're able to help a lot with some of our closed areas, such as rockfish conservation areas. They check them all the time. And then our National Fisheries Intel Service program is now fully staffed in the West. So we've got all our 5 area intel officers that are feeding in data from the field to the intel system, where we have 3 analysts, 2 supervisors, and a chief, and 1 quality control person. So this is helping us to direct our resources to where the fish, and in the case of halibut, where the greatest damage is occurring. I will be working more closely with them in the next year to see how we can coordinate with all our platforms and have them analyze some of the data that we already have on halibut, and hopefully that will help us home in on some of the most serious problems. We have a group on the island, our regional investigation service, that are doing regular checks of social media, where we're seeing quite a bit of sales advertised. So that's another area where we will continually be adapting and improving on our responses. And I think the occurrences are generally, our service providers, our dockside observers generate most of the commercial occurrences. Stakeholders also call our ORR line. They'll call me or our groundfish managers, DFO staff, members of the public, fishery officers, and as I mentioned, social media are sources of occurrences that we follow up. And then some end up as violations, and then we investigate and charges are laid as appropriate. And that's it. So if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer them, and thank you very much.
All right. Any questions for Ann? Yes, go ahead.
Short one. Just curious if the closed areas are, for the rockfish conservation closed areas, those are closed to all fishing, just commercial fishing? Just
That's a really good question. No, they're not. They're open to our trap fisheries. They're open to our FSC fishing, so that's food, social, ceremonial.
Okay.
And the closed areas I'm referring to are not just rockfish conservation areas, but marine protected areas. And there's a number of other ones as well. So basically, except for FSC fishing, it would be, commercial would be trap, so prawn, crab can fish in RCAs. And
thanks.
You're welcome.
Do you recall how many there are, Ann, in the region? Number? Like it's about 5,000 square kilometers, I think, in total area that's closed.
I don't know the exact, but there's quite a significant area, which we're trying to up. Our federal mandate is to increase protected areas, so that will be there's a lot of meetings and consultation going on right now.
All right, thanks, Ann.
Thanks.
Steve, you were mentioning that there's some folks here that need to catch a plane.
Right. We would start their last reports with NIMS, and they would introduce them and maybe report.
Yeah, so with your indulgence, we'll hear that report and then take a break. Who's going to provide that report?
afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Rachel Baker. Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Baker from the National Marine Fisheries Service in the Alaska region. Just going to do a really brief introduction of this next presentation you'll receive. Just a little background. The National Marine Fisheries Service in Alaska and the Alaska Fisheries Science Center are currently working with the trawl catcher processor sector in the Bering Sea to reduce mortality rates of halibut bycatch for vessels that target groundfish species other than pollock. This ongoing work is being led by the Alaska Seafood Cooperative and John Govan as principal investigator of a multi-year, what we call exempted fishing permit, or an EFP. So NMFS issued the EFP to allow fishery participants to account for halibut catches and mortality on deck for catcher processor vessels, whereas catch accounting normally occurs below the deck. So that's why we call it a deck sorting EFP. And vessels in the EFP are exempted from certain regulations related to catch handling, prohibited species, and observer sampling practices. The exemptions are required to allow halibut to be returned to the water faster and with lower mortality than would otherwise occur. And the current EFP, or excuse me, experimental work is being conducted under an EFP that spans 2016 and 17. And this EFP was recently modified to allow the participants to adjust observer coverage to account for differences in groundfish catch and factory production rates to help reduce some lower target species production rates that were seen in previous EFPs. And the modified EFP will also provide new information on improved observer sampling stations, modified observer work schedules, and some new video monitoring requirements. And so Mr. Govan is here today to provide you with a presentation covering some general information about the deck sorting and participation in the EFP, as well as performance data for 2016, and some information from the industry's perspective about the potential for the program to reduce halibut mortality in the future if deck sorting achieves full-scale operation in the fisheries. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Govan.
Yeah, thanks, Chair and Commissioners, for the opportunity to provide you a little bit of information on our deck sorting EFP. And as Rachel mentioned, it's an ongoing collaboration with NMFS region and Alaska Fisheries Science Center. You'll be hearing more about the Amendment 80 sector's halibut bycatch reductions. So this is sort of a part of that, but Mark Fina, I believe, and Chris Woodley will be giving you more on that. So I'm the Science Projects Director for the Alaska Seafood Cooperative. But I will say that this work now goes beyond our co-op and covers both co-ops in the Amendment 80 sector as well as other vessels that are catcher processors that target non-pollock species in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. These data cover May through the end of the year. We didn't get the permit till May, so this all of the deck sorting activities that occurred in 2016. So what is this deck sorting about? Well, currently the regulations don't allow for anything to be sorted on deck of these vessels. It all gets dumped into a tank, comes into the processing area, and is all available for fishery observer sampling at that point. So it takes a change in the regulations of an exemption to be able to sort something on deck and a set of guidelines for how that can occur to get good accounting of the catch. Any catcher processor in the Bering Sea could participate in this EFP now. It's beyond our co-op, as I mentioned, but they had to agree to change their fishing practices under the EFP, work with the vessels to use the latest information on what's achieving lower mortality rates for the halibut. And so you're not just going to fish as you did before. You're going to adjust the tow duration, etc. You've got to follow the catch handling protocols that are very strictly applied in this EFP, and you have to take additional observers and additional monitoring in the form of cameras both on deck and in the factory. So just going to give you some pictures. I'm actually going to try to get some video here. So depending on the size of the vessel, this deck sorting, basically you pull the cod end forward. This boat is a large one, has a large deck, so they're spilling the catch out. Normally that would just be right in front of the
hatch for the below deck tank. In this case, they're spilling out the catch and sorting out the halibut and sliding it down that chute. It's a large vessel. Here's sort of a medium-sized vessel that does that deck sorting very close to the stern ramp and has this area where the halibut are slid up to, an observer waiting for the halibut there. This boat has an odd configuration, has this chute going all over the place to get the halibut back in the water. And they're using these large squeegees to push the catch back into the target catch into the tank there. Here's a small boat. A lot of our boats are in the 120-foot range that are doing deck sorting. And there you have a combination of both factory crew and the captain out on the deck sorting. And there's the observer measuring a halibut. So just to give you an idea of the scale of this, the EFP spans a few years now, and in 2015 we had 9 boats doing deck sorting, and this last year we had 12. So the overall population of vessels is adds about 7 to that, about 19 active catcher processors in these fisheries. So we had 12 of them last year. That's a large amount. The ones that didn't participate are typically ones that move back and forth from the Gulf of Alaska fisheries or in the Aleutians and just couldn't work with our project managers and make their timing work, because we always put a project manager on their first trip so they know what they're doing when they get out there. I'll say, as I said, we started in May, but the participants tend to do a far greater amount of their flatfish and related other non-pollock fishing in the EFP compared to 2015. And the deck sorting expanded greatly from fisheries that started out mostly in flathead sole and arrow-tooth flounder, where the fishermen thought it would be easiest to do, but actually now has expanded into a great deal of the elephant sole fishing, some cod targeting, Pacific Ocean perch, and even into Atka mackerel. Mr. Chair, if people want to ask questions as I go, I'd be happy, whatever your rules are here. This is going to be too small for you to see. So this is the deck sorting performance by boat. It's in your packet or whatever I've supplied to you for 2016, and here's 2015. But the way to look at this is in the bottom line difference, I think, is easier. So the amount of groundfish that was done in this EFP this year in 2016 was almost 80,000 tons of groundfish. A 41,000 increase from the 2015. So you can, as I said, a lot more people got into this and stayed in it longer. And the bottom line in terms of the halibut mortality rate that was achieved by getting these halibut back in the water from deck was in 2015 we got a 49% rate of mortality, and in 2016 a 45% rate, so 4 percentage points lower, if you will. And so if you looked at this catch of halibut that I have up there and looked at what the mortality would have been had you not been in deck sorting, we would have applied an 85% mortality rate. So applying these lower rates, we're able to achieve a 200 and almost 290 tons of savings of mortality, which was an additional 114 tons of savings over the year before. Other metrics that I thought you'd be interested in. One of the questions I've always been asked, well, if you're doing deck sorting, are you still going to avoid halibut mortality? Just looking at 2015 and then 2016, captains are integrating this into their fishing better. They actually had a lower encounter rate of halibut. In 2015 it was 1.3%, and in 2016 it was slightly under 1%. Boats tended to use halibut excluders and deck sorting for some of the time, you know, I think this is largely, with all the efforts in the ammonium sector and other sectors here that use halibut in the Bering Sea, an effort to throw everything they can out there. I mentioned that because in one case, one of the excluders that the boat was using was actually part of a tagging project. We had other boats that in that tagging project with these satellite tags, and we seemed to see some possibilities that the excluder, a brand new design that seemed to work well in terms of allowing escapement, but for the halibut that didn't escape, there was siltation in the gills. We haven't really figured out why, and the mortality rates were higher for those fish. So again, we haven't figured this all yet. We had other boats in that tagging project that used excluders that didn't have that. So I can't tell you I understand this, but it was interesting. And so when these boats are in deck sorting, they tend to be able to sort out about 85% of the halibut by weight. That occurred in both years, and they generally do that in about 20 minutes. I think crews did a better job keeping the sorting times down to 20 minutes in 2016. They are learning that sometimes not getting everyone is better, to just pick the most viable fish, and so that's kind of evolution of thinking of how to do this. We, not only in our Amendment 80 fishing, but the boats that do community development quota, were able to successfully do that in the into the EFP this year. We weren't able to do trawl limited access because the fishery closed before we started the EFP in May. This is a challenge for the agency that's working with us, because putting this data from a community development quota into their data system, it created a number of challenges of how to make that not get double counted or whatever. So, and this year we used, in 2016, NIMS observers. We didn't have sea samplers out there, so these boats all have 2 normal observers. To do the project in 2016, you had to have 3 observers, and there were regular NIMS observers working for NIMS. So all the debriefing and work that NIMS does normally with observers had to be adjusted to the EFP, so they would know how to follow the regulations with some briefings. And again, as I mentioned, we put a field project manager from my employee on these boats to make sure the crew knows what they're supposed to do on each first trip when you get into the EFP. We successfully use video monitoring in the deck and in the factory, and we've done work with NIMS to do follow-up, to actually sit down the crews and have them look at the video. How well did you handle the halibut? Where could you improve? And NIMS started to work on standards for work tables and chutes so that observers could have good working conditions. So it's been a very collaborative effort with the agency. So where could we improve based on 2016? One of the things, that the 3 observers working 8-hour shifts, we had a lot of comments from observers that they weren't as busy as they could be, and they thought that maybe some adjustments there would be worthwhile. And then really what a lot of the rules for the boats participating in this, you can't run fish in the factory while you're doing deck sorting. So they had these interruptions in production of the boats, and so a lot of the thinking went into how could we allow boats to do that and use the observer coverage better so they can be in both places at once. So, ta-da! How do we modify the EFP that's now underway? We actually have boats doing deck sorting as we speak. We started fishing January 20th. We have now options for boats that can live with the current production slowdowns, the smaller boats typically. They can stay with their normal complement of observers, but if you want to run fish while the deck sorting is occurring, you have to have an observer down there, so you can have 3 and have a 12-hour overlap period where you can do that. If you're willing to take 4 observers and have the bunks for it, you can run fish whenever you want and deck sort whenever you want. That's a spendy way to do it, but it definitely is nice to have that option, I guess. We're implementing table height requirements based on what we learned last year, and we're using NIMS data forms now rather than specific ones for the EFP. The biggest change is that opening this up now to as many boats, and what these new rules will do, we do expect to have additional participants, so getting more toward the whole fleet doing this. We have a new boat coming, a new construction boat, that some of the construction takes into account this, as they've been watching it evolve over the EFPs. And we've heard from all the boats that are in the fleet that want to try this year. So I think we will have a big expansion this year. Recently, the Fishing Company of Alaska's boats were bought out by a couple companies, and we expect they'll be in the deck sorting program this coming year. Okay, I've covered most of this. Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is real collaboration. I think it's going well. We're getting a lot of assistance now with the agency to help us work towards getting this into implementation and regulation. But what I think is really good is the work through an exempted fishing permit is we've been able to figure out how to do this best and how to adjust the rules and the protocols in a manner that if we had tried to write regulations 2 years ago, we'd be trying to amend those right now. So we're using the EFP in a smart way to figure out what works and what will be stable once this does get implemented. So I just, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll just show a few videos. I think a picture tells a little words, but the video really shows what this looks like. Jim, can I ask you to run the videos, because I don't actually know how to do that from here. So if you can run the one that's DS Constellation. I think that's 2, but it's a different one, sorry. I thought DS, there you go. Okay, so this is just one of the boats that I think shows well how to do this boat's got a crew that's done this in all the EFPs, and here they've pulled the cod end up and the tanks behind them. This is when they're doing some cod fishing, and so this boat doesn't throw a lot of crew members at this, maybe 4 or 5. Other boats use it up to 12. So you'll see they're just shoveling the fish down into the tank. What they've mastered is sort of how to open up the cod end without creating a large rush of fish. Of course, this is a perfect weather day on the Bering Sea, and you know, they got their sunscreen on and all that. Well, maybe not. Yeah, well, part of this is a mounted camera, so it moves with the boat, okay? Yeah, we don't have it ever this calm, but you'll see sooner or later but they're really good at seeing. There's a guy there who's just, you know, very experienced at figuring out when a halibut's going to come through there, and there they all jump on it and slide it over to this chute where the crew member who feeds them to the observer. Now that one didn't get sampled. He's got a random sampling schedule. It's a roughly 1 out of 5 fish, but it's randomized. And that one's not in as good a shape.
How much does it add to the time to go through the?
It takes, typically the deck sorting is 20 minutes per tow, and they're doing 5 tows per day. But when you think about it, it's the guys who've got to get their rain gear on, go out there, do this, and then dump the fish and go back down into the factory. So it adds, we figure we lose about a tow a day. And so one company figured out by doing deck sorting this year, they added actually for each boat about a month of fishing. So the same revenue, but the cost, if you will, is the added cost of operating to reduce halibut mortality. If I could show deck sorting SAM, that's Sea Freeze America. I want to show you a different boat. It's actually new to deck sorting this year. You'll see they threw a lot more people at it. This was in the later in the fall. Higher volumes of fish. It's a bigger boat, and you'll see what weather can do as you're doing this. I'm not going to show the ones I showed at the council because that was. You know, the people were worried that we're doing this, but anyway, this isn't that bad a day, but that's the kind of, and if you can hit the next one, it says SAM halibut handling. I'll show you how, you know, they were able to move halibut off their deck. These are pretty short videos. Not as experienced, but you know, they're handling the fish correctly, which is important. That's also a non-sampled fish. All they do is take a number when it's a non-sampled fish. And then finally, just deck sorting ATF, which is arrow-tooth flounder. I'm glad he's doing this. I would be like clicking on the wrong thing. So this is about doing arrow-tooth flounder. You would think it would be hard to separate halibut from arrow-tooth flounder, but it really isn't. And these guys have been doing it for a while. And they've actually put that little belt on there, which if you get a big halibut, it's useful. It's a little slow. Sometimes they just walk it up there. But when you get a 50-pound halibut, that belt is useful. So one last one, the one that's Atka mackerel. This is a fishery I never really thought we would do deck sorting in because they don't get a lot of halibut. But this boat fishes at a time of year when they do get some halibut. So they tried this, and you can see how well a halibut should, well, maybe you won't be able to see. Oh. Okay, well, anyway, can't have it all. What you'd see is Atka mackerel will look really different from halibut. Oh, here they are. And these guys were quite good at this. Right out of the blocks, if you will. So our project manager on the boat will work with the crew to how to handle the halibut so they're not lifting them by the tail or grabbing them by the gills. And this is how we collect the data. I think he's actually going to do a viability on this one. Maybe not. Seem to have. Okay. Well, anyway, we'll take any questions, but I wanted to give you an idea what you've heard a lot of this deck sorting, and so I think this gives you an idea what it looks like.
Yeah, thanks for those movies. That's very helpful to see that. Any questions for John? Yeah, Linda.
Thanks, John. It's a great presentation. I had two questions. One, are you, in any way, there was, concern at the beginning of this shifting focus onto getting big fish over as opposed to little fish because of the poundage issue, and I just wonder how you're tracking that and if that's something you can speak to.
Yeah, so we get a lot of data. Each one of these hauls, we get all the size data from the measured fish, and we get the individual viabilities. So we've sat down with we've done a lot of statistical analysis, and what's interesting is the time out of water really is very much related to survival rate, and then we start looking at the size of the fish. We don't see that bright line. We have some small fish that seem to be very viable. What the crews tend to do is really adjust it, and they look at the mortality rates they're going, because they get the data on every haul, and they actually talk to the crew about, don't try to get everyone. In this fishery right now, it's better to just get could be the bigger fish, could be the most viable. Other ones, they think it's really worth it to get everyone, and they might spend 25 minutes doing it. So it's really, having the data really allows them to optimize this. And I've not seen any bright line that it was one thing that seems large fish, small fish. You saw at the council one guy sorting the smallest halibut that's ever been deck sorted. But, he at that time he probably had information that was working for the boat. And that what it really incentivizes this is the boat is getting their own data and a fast turnaround basis, and they're getting credit if they can reduce the mortality rate.
Yeah, Linda, and then Bob.
My one other question, you gave us a figure for the encounter rate dropping from 2015 to 2016. Was that did you only see that drop in the EFP boats, or do you know if there was an encounter rate drop in the non-EFP boats?
Yeah, that's a good question. Good thing is Mark Fina's behind me, and he'll know about the rest of the fishery. I just looked at it in the deck sorting part. That's the only thing I had data for. We're compartmentalizing now, but I just looked at that, and it may have gone down. Definitely, we use more excluders in different fisheries, so Mark could answer that. But I have a sense it probably did, but I didn't cut it. You've got a different set of fisheries in this, maybe, so it'd be hard to compare those two.
Bob?
So great job, John. I know you've been working on this for a long time, and your group has, and I forgot the number now, but it was over almost 300,000, was it, that you saved? It said up there.
Oh, you're thinking in pounds or something? Yeah, it was. Yeah, I don't think in pounds, but it was well over.
Tons, maybe that's.
200 tons plus of savings. We're tons.
So the
sorry.
The EFP that you're working under, when does it expire, and is it going to be renewed, or how does that work for the next year?
So it was an EFP issued spanning 2015 and 2016. Based on what we learned in 2015, we sat down with the agency. They looked at the data, we looked at the data, we talked about what worked and what didn't, had these meetings, and so we made those adjustments I talked about, and they have modified this permit now to reflect those. In fact, Dr. Balsiger signed it like last week, so we started this thing January 20th. So this will go now till the end of 2017, and I think depending on what we learn here, we're definitely want to start working on the implementation of this into regulation, but we got to analyze these results and see if there's anything else that we need to do. But what I wanted to convey to you is that everybody that wants to do deck sorting, and a great proportion of the fleet now, can do it under the EFP. So the not implementing it is not slowing down the savings, as I see that the scale of this will go this year.
Yeah, Bob.
The recent news of AFA's boats being bought and their quota being bought, those FCA, Fishing Company of Alaska. Yeah. So will that quota now be caught on O'Hara's existing boats, or will they use the previous boats of Fishing Company of Alaska? Because I think they participate in this process.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
And I don't think.
Yeah, I don't really know much about how that's all going to work. I don't think anybody does at this point. The Fishing Company of Alaska was listed as a participant, or could have participated. They were on the permit in 2016. They did not participate. I think they intended to participate anyway. I don't know at what scale, but my comment at the beginning was the companies that are purchased that have been well entrenched in this deck sorting effort. So I would expect that would add to the effort here.
All right. John, I think you're about to depart. Is that
Yes,
right?
thank you very much for accommodating me. I've got to fly up to Alaska tonight, so this was the last call for getting off the island, as they say.
Yeah, right. I just wonder if there was any questions from anyone in the audience. No?
Anybody wants to give me a ride to the airport?
All right, thanks very much, John, for that presentation. So let's take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back and finish off with the rest of 2C and 3, I think. Is that right?
Well, all of the master reports together.
Are they all together?
And they're scheduled on one. This is just the start in order to accommodate the Canadian report. So we can continue with some of the master reports this afternoon.
What would people like to do?
Sorry, I missed that. We got where we needed our schedule to get today already.
Correct. The 2A and 2B reports were what was scheduled for this afternoon. Alaska reports for tomorrow morning. We started the Alaska reports early in order to accommodate John Dobbins' report here.
I certainly don't mind working another hour. We want to spend some time with the U.S. later, but up to you.
Have a little break.
Let's have a break and then carry on with some reports till 4:30. Well, actually, we won't go that long because I think wanted to have a chance for public comment and questions. So let's get back together in 15 minutes. We'll have reports that will allow at least 15 minutes for public comment and questions. So we'll conclude any more reports by about, let's say, 10 after 4.
I don't know how that works, but in order to try and get it.
We attempt to accomplish these goals through visible patrols on the water and direct interaction with fishery participants to both detect violations and deter noncompliance, with the hopeful end state being a consistent high level of at-sea compliance with fishery management regulations. Our aircraft and cutter patrols are an important component of promoting compliance, and we organize these patrols throughout the season through the implementation of Operation Alaskan Sentinel, which organizes the focus of the U.S. Coast Guard's at-sea law enforcement effort on Alaska's halibut and sablefish fisheries. In implementing Alaskan Sentinel, we focus on two primary principles: fostering productive partnerships and striving for effective presence. To help ensure our unit crews and boarding teams are being effective, all units involved in fisheries enforcement receive training from the Coast Guard's North Pacific Regional Fisheries Training Center in Kodiak, Alaska. NOAA fisheries agents and Alaska State fisheries enforcement officials routinely participate in the training, as well as ride on cutters and aircraft during some of our fisheries enforcement patrols. Additionally, District 17 and our units conduct dedicated pulse operations throughout the IFQ season, often in conjunction with our law enforcement partners such as NOAA, ADF&G, and Alaska Wildlife Troopers. The effectiveness of the Coast Guard's fisheries enforcement operations is greatly enhanced by collaboration with our enforcement partners. Sighting information obtained from our aircraft helps to ensure vessels have quota holders for the area being fished, and this sighting information is available for our enforcement partners in NOAA, Office of Law Enforcement, to support any of their investigatory needs. So they will conduct queries of the fishing vessels as they fly over them and provide these sighting reports to our subunits. Commissioner Benkin, to answer your earlier question on the increased boarding efforts between 2015 and 2016, 2015 was a bit of a transition year for our 110-foot patrol boats in the Gulf of Alaska. We were decommissioning several older class cutters and bringing back up to speed several of the newer cutters during 2015. And in 2016, we had a full complement of the three that brought up to speed. And with that, in conjunction with an increased push of the dedicated pulse operations with our partner agencies, as well as better weather between the 2 years and more available assets, we were able to really focus on an increased number of recreational boardings. So, you're welcome. I would like to go back to the very first slide too, the cover slide, if I can. This slide, I wanted to mention, these are the Coast Guard's new fast response cutters. They're 154-foot cutters, and we are bringing 2 of them up to Ketchikan, Alaska, where they will be home ported. Information is in the enforcement report. So eventually the Coast Guard will have 6 of these fast response cutters, which have a much more increased range and capability to conduct boardings in the Gulf of Alaska. So we hope to expect to see higher boarding numbers even more over the next couple of years with these additional capabilities. So, all right. And these are the boarding and violation summaries by industry sector between the 2 years. So you'll see an increased number of boardings, also reflected in increased rate of compliance across all industry sectors, as a smaller percentage of the boardings detected violations of IPHC and federal fisheries regulations. And this slide provides an overview of Coast Guard IFQ charter and sport halibut boarding and violation rates over the last 5 years. So as you can see, we've had a slight fluctuation in our boarding efforts, but overall a general trend upwards of our boarding efforts. And the blue line represents the fisheries violation rate, and the yellow bars the fishery violations. And I'll just go over the areas by the IPHC areas and the boarding efforts to kind of give you a number of the Coast Guard's boarding efforts. And later slides I'll go over the nature of the violations as well, a brief nature. So in 2C, we mainly see recreational subsistence boardings. 3A and 3B, we conducted 180 boardings. Again, the majority of those being recreational and subsistence due to the increased capabilities in the Gulf of Alaska of our patrol boats. Our 3 patrol boats are home ported in Homer, Seward, and Valdez, with an additional small boat station in Valdez and Prince William Sound. So there were a lot of boardings in those areas. 3A, 3B line is still an area that is a bit more difficult for us to get assets out to because of the range of our 110-foot patrol boat cutters. The closest port for them to fuel and get logistics is Kodiak. So to get down to the Shumagins or near 3A, the 3A and 3B line would be pretty far from their home port. And for areas 4A through E, we had 29 boardings, all of those being IFQ or CDQ. These boardings are all done by our one Bering Sea cutter that we have out there at all times, usually a 378-foot cutter. Those are home ported either in California or Hawaii, and they come up and we have 100% coverage at all times in the Bering Sea. And this is an overview of the fisheries violations, including the written warnings and the fix-it that were noticed. So as you can see, the mainly logbook entries or fishing without licenses were the larger concentrations of violations. And some of these also were issued by NOAA as well during joint boardings during our pulse operations. And that concludes my presentation of Coast Guard's reporting reports. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks very much, man. Bob, looks like you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask what was the breakout of them, and then she just showed that chart at the table. So
okay,
that was my question.
All right. Any other commissioners have questions, Ruben? Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the two new fast response cutters in Ketchikan, how much of their mission is fish enforcement? I'm sure it changes as incidents arise, but is it 10%, 20%? Do you have any guidelines?
I don't have an exact percentage, Dr. Bossiger, but I will say that a large majority of their regular patrols will be on fisheries enforcement. We are counting on them to be underway for several weeks at a time, and not just through Southeast, but all throughout the Gulf of Alaska. And unless there is a search and rescue case pending, we will be expecting them to do fisheries patrols for the majority of the time. You're welcome.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think next is the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, and going to have a report from Chris Oliver and Dan Hall.
Good afternoon. I don't, may take longer than 10 or 15 minutes, but we'll at least get started on it. You've got the letter that we submitted in your packet. It's about 9 or 10 pages, and it covers about a dozen different halibut-related items that the council is working on. And Dan and I attended your October meeting, and we discussed the council's research priority process, and particularly talked about research priorities that were related to halibut. And one of those priorities was established really jointly with the Commission when we met in February of 2015, and that was pursuing this abundance-based PSC management approach. So, and I'll review quickly where we're at on that. And we reviewed a discussion paper in October on the abundance-based approach, or ABM approach, which was prepared by an interagency work group of staff, council staff, National Marine Fisheries Service, and your staff as well. Dr. Hicks is on that group. And that was preceded by a public workshop that we held in Seattle. And that paper really focused on, and I'm going to cover this briefly, Dr. Stram on our staff, who is the leader of that work group, is here. If you have one additional detail or you have questions, she's here this week to help answer those detailed questions for you or the PAG or the conference board as necessary. But the council has identified 5 general objectives, and obviously the first is indexing PSC to abundance, protecting spawning stock biomass at low levels, allowing flexibility in ground fish operations, maintaining halibut-directed fishing operations, and some stability in PSC limits. Now, obviously, some of those objectives are some competing objectives. Anytime the council deals with bycatch, they're obviously balancing two obviously competing objectives. One is to allow ground fish fishing opportunities to proceed, at the same time minimizing halibut bycatch mortality as it pertains to the directed fishery and other users. So they did not specify a prioritization or attempt to quantify those objectives. Rather, they asked the work group to gave direction to the work group relative to the next iteration of this analysis. And the process that we are in is going to involve a public workshop that's going to be held in conjunction with the council meeting next week in Seattle. That's going to be on Thursday afternoon, next Thursday, February the 2nd at the Renaissance Hotel. And the idea is to get constituent and public feedback on developing the performance metrics that will ultimately have to go into what's going to be an extensive analysis of this ABM approach. And so based on the input we get from that workshop, and I'll just back up, an example, probably a really obvious example of performance metrics for which we may want to specify a numeric range for a relative target catch level in both directed halibut fisheries, for example, as well as groundfish fisheries, back to those two sort of primarily competing objectives. So based on input from that workshop, the work group will continue to develop a range of alternative control rules and different indices to use to base those control rules on, and come back to the council with an additional discussion paper at our April meeting, which is going to be in Anchorage. And we know that the Commission is keenly interested in this initiative, and we had discussed the potential for input, various ways the Commission could provide input. Obviously, we welcome your participation if you're available next week at this workshop. We've also discussed having a joint meeting with the Commission, as we did in February of 2015, and we could either look at April for that, or possibly a more likely target in our mind would be our June, perhaps in conjunction with our June council meeting, which is going to be in Juneau, Alaska. And I guess just generally we wanted to provide some assurance that while this is a council priority, the train is not so far down the tracks that it's going to preclude input from you and from the Commission. And we did also discuss the council the inclusion. Originally this was based or aimed targeted at the Bering Sea, and we've also discussed including the Gulf of Alaska in this initiative. And while the workshop is going to focus, this February workshop is going to focus on the Bering Sea and development of performance metrics relative to the Bering Sea initiative, we also asked the analysts to provide a section in the next iteration of the analysis addressing the considerations that would be necessary to include the Gulf of Alaska. So I'm going to pause there, Mr. Chairman, before I go into the other items in our letter. And I'm not going to read every detail of the other 12 items, but try to hit the parts that I think are most pertinent for you. But I want to pause on this one because I know there's a lot of interest in this, and we may want Dr. Strand to come up to the table if you have detailed questions.
All right. Thanks very much, Chris. I'll just see if there's questions for you. Maybe the workshop that's occurring on February the 2nd, So that what you said we'll be looking at, I think, performance measures. Is that right?
Performance metrics by which to measure the different indices and control rules against the objectives that we're trying to achieve. And probably this is a really good spot for me to invite Dr. Stram up to give you a little better explanation or some examples of what that would be, what that would entail.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Diana Stram, Council staff. We posted some materials for the workshop on our website as well as on our agenda for the council meeting. And the purpose of the workshop, as Mr. Oliver indicated, is to basically get some stakeholder input on taking some of the broad objectives that we've been calling overarching goals from the council's motion and translating them into measurable objectives that we can then analyze in a subsequent analysis, and from the measurable objectives coming up with some performance metrics. So what we posted on our website is a kind of a guide for where we're going to, what we're going to use to run this workshop, which is providing the overarching goals, some questions that we have for stakeholder consideration and input, and then we provided from our work group some measurable objectives, for instance, in terms of looking at flexibility and not unnecessarily constraining groundfish fisheries. One of the measurable objectives we looked at was is groundfish catch above a certain level, and then looking at a performance metric that would give you the probability that catch is below or above a certain level. So those are the kind of things that we were trying to provide for the workshop so that we can get some stakeholder input as to when you're looking at directed halibut fishery catch, what are the metrics, what are the objectives that you want? Is it for a specific level in a specific area? And as such, we'd like input from the stakeholders to help us guide what would be measurable objectives that would go along with those goals, if that helps.
If I could add, Sharon, I don't know if you have the copy of the materials that Diana referenced were posted just recently, since they weren't available when this letter was submitted to you. We can make sure you have a copy of those.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm just wondering, on the stakeholder side, who does that include?
Mr. Chairman, it's a public workshop, so we are hoping to get broad participation from folks that are at the council meeting as well as people that are interested from the IPHC.
All user groups, directed fisheries, bycatch users, trawl sector.
Okay. Jim, did you have a question?
Do we have in mind a timeline on when this might get around to, potentially get around to regulation and the new way of looking at PSC limits?
I don't have a specific timeline. If you look at these type of things as they go through the council, as you're aware of the council process, and then the subsequent rulemaking process after council action, I would suspect that depending on the resolution and direction we get from the council coming out of the April and probably the June meetings, it would take us, don't hold me to this, being this is probably an optimistic estimate, it would take us the rest of the year to get a formal analysis done that, of course, adheres to all the applicable laws and everything we have to do to get through our process. If the council took action in, say, late this year, or more realistically, say sometime early next year, it would be probably at least an additional year for the review and implementation process. So I think you're looking at least 2 years before this would actually be in place, and that's probably the optimistic timeline, just given how our process works.
Thank you, I agree, but I just for expectations, I thought it was useful. Thanks.
Chris, you were mentioning maybe it would be better to set something up for June versus your April meeting. Is that just to provide some more time for completion of some of the analysis?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. You know, I don't expect to get full council definition of the final suite of alternatives in April. I think that's more realistically something that would happen in June. And it was just a matter of timing, really, that suggestion, because April's coming up on us pretty quick.
Right.
It might be more available. The commissioners might be more available in June than April is one way of thinking, but that's really we'd like to hear from you what you think and whether we need it to meet and when would be best for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yep. I'm going to move on to the second item, and this is an important item, obviously, because this is one of the couple items in our letter that will actually, of course, require commission action at this meeting, and that is our management measures for the charter halibut fishery in areas 2C and 3A. And the council is recommending to the commission the following annual management measures, and these were evaluated through our charter halibut management implementation committee and then through the council at our December meeting. These were, and you'll hear perhaps a little bit more from Scott Meyer on this when he gives his ADF&G report, because he's the person that basically does the analysis for us based on your the numbers that came out of your October interim meeting, and very shortly thereafter our council December meeting, so he had a lot of work to do in about a week. But in essence, for Area 2C, we're still recommending a 1 fish daily bag limit with the reverse slot limit, the under 40, over 80 reverse slot limit, and an annual limit of 3 halibut. They also included some recommendations in the event that the allocation is above or below the blue line, and that essentially consists of incrementally reducing the lower size limit until the projected harvest falls within the allocation in the event it's below the blue line, and of course the opposite in the event that it's above the blue line, and and an annual limit of 5 fish in that instance. So all of those numbers have been run by Mr. Meyer, and they're available to you depending on where you end up on those at this meeting. With regard to Area 3A, still a 2 fish bag limit, one of any size, but one with a maximum size of 28 inches, an annual limit of 4 fish, a prohibition on charter fishing on Wednesdays throughout the year, a restriction to the use of 1 charter halibut fishing trip per calendar day for each charter permit, and a prohibition on fishing on Tuesdays as described in the attached table in order to bring the projected removals below the charter allocation. So it's a little more complicated in Area 3A than in 2C, obviously, but those are essentially the measures that the council is asking or recommending that you adopt, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
I'll pause again because I know this is an important issue.
And what I think I'm hearing, Chris, is that this has been done in the past too. So these current measures are based upon what you said was the blue line, and they would be adjusted if there was some other outcome.
Correct.
Does it take very long? Just remind me to make those adjustments. I think it's pretty quick. You do it at the meeting?
Yes, those numbers are available. Scott has the tables to refer to. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Does anyone have questions for Chris on this particular item? Linda.
Maybe one. So I'm a big believer in the stakeholder process that was set up to come up with these recommendations from 2C and 3A charter operators about how to best live within the limits that are set. And I was surprised to see some proposals into the IPHC for different limits in 3A. And so I don't know if you're the best people to answer this, but my understanding is it's a very open process, that we have a committee that's representative of those who are involved in the fishery. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the proposal from individuals and why they differ.
Commissioner Benkin, I can't at all, no, and they did not come up in conversation that I've had with Mr. Mesereau, who's the council member chairman of that committee, so perhaps those were submitted before the committee met. That's about all I can think of,
And I have not talked to Andy, to Mr. Mesereau, as Dan pointed out, so Andy might have some more insights on your question, but I can't answer it sitting here. I'll talk to Andy and see if he has any more information.
All right, I think that's the questions on that part, Chris.
Okay. The next item I wanted to talk to is the council's action that they took in December on the Charter Halibut Recreational Quota Entity, the RQE, which allows the formation of a recreational quota entity to purchase and hold commercial halibut quota share to augment the charter catch limits in areas 2C and 3A. Basically, these holdings would augment the pounds allocated through the catch sharing plan, and would be the new basis on which halibut charter annual management measures are established in the future, depending on what those holdings become. They are, the council in approving this program, and again, this won't be in effect until next year, but those groups still are in the formation phase, but they wanted to mitigate negative impacts, potential negative impacts on other halibut user groups by including a series of restrictions on this program. And in essence, an annual restriction of 1% of the commercial quota share in Area 2C and 1.2% of up to 1.2% in Area 3A. And there are a lot of other details and provisions in the program aimed at achieving that balance, and I'm not going to go through and read every one of them, Mr. Chairman. That I think the real essence of it is those two numbers, 1% in 2C and up to 1.2%, and 3A would be available for those RQ entities to purchase and hold quota share for use by the charter sector.
So they can purchase the quota or lease it or both, or just purchase?
They're allowed to purchase the quota and hold or purchase the quota shares and then hold the underlying annual IFQ that's associated with it.
I have a question. And under, pardon my ignorance in all of this, but it's an interesting concept. Under which suite of regulations would that quota come then? Would it be under the commercial regulations or under the charter regulations?
I'm not sure. So if I might, I'll try to answer. I think maybe you're asking, it's quota that's it's part of the IFQ program in essence. So they become these quota share, recreational quota entities are allowed to hold commercial quota in the same way that we have community quota entities who can also hold it as entities that are different from other IFQ individuals, but it's all a part of our IFQ program. But the quota itself, management of the annual pounds associated with that quota falls under the charter management program. So it's just additional pounds that the charter committee would take into consideration in recommending management measures annually to the council.
Okay, thank you.
What's that? Yeah, the 1%, 1.2.
And if we get to a point where you need to stop, just let us know, Mr. Chairman, and we'll pick this up again tomorrow. So
yeah, sure. That would be good.
I'd probably get through at least a few more of these, if not all of them. In the whole discussion of the charter halibut fishery management, the council also asked our staff to prepare a discussion paper, which we reviewed in December, with information on the use of charter halibut permits. And basically, it was council was interested on the latent capacity and use by charter halibut permits by and what the leasing incidence of leasing was, and basically a desire for a clear and more accurate understanding of charter halibut permit holdings, uses, and trends in active participation. And so based on that, the council initiated a regulatory amendment analysis. They haven't approved it yet. It was supposed to go through our analytical process, which would develop an annual registration process for both transferable and non-transferable charter permits. And that's something that we'll be working on over the next several months. We don't have it necessarily scheduled yet for council action, but it will, if the council approves this at some point, we'll develop an annual registration process so that we can track the holdings and use of those permits and the trends in their participation, in essence. And I'm really paraphrasing here. The next item I wanted to talk about is the recent program review we had of the halibut and sablefish IFQ program, and the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is our umbrella legislation for national fisheries management, mandates the periodic review of all limited access privilege programs, or LAPs. And in October, the Council received a presentation of a first comprehensive review of the halibut and sablefish IFQ program, basically 20 years since its implementation in 1995. And based on a scope that was determined through several Council discussion, the document was framed around 10 original objectives, and in addition to the topic of entry opportunities in these two fisheries. And based on that review, the Council found it to be a comprehensive and well done review. It's not an action document per se, but the Council has reconstituted its IFQ committee that was originally formed back in '95 as the IFQ Implementation Committee to deal with different challenges and changes in the program. And that committee has now been reconstituted and the membership broadened to represent a broad range of stakeholders in the IFQ fisheries, from both directed halibut and sablefish fisheries, second generation quota share holders, and representation which is intended to cover multiple areas across the Gulf and the Bering Sea, as well as processors involved. And their task, if you will, is to look at the findings from that IFQ program review and evaluate when we have a list of specific issues that the Council has tasked them to look at that stem from that review, and I've listed those here in your letter. But they've also given the committee a little bit of a broader role in the sense of bringing forward to the Council any further concerns that are identified by that committee that stem from the findings in the review document. So they're going to be meeting next week in conjunction with our Council meeting in Seattle, and they're going to provide a report to the Council on those discussions and recommendations on these topics related to the program review. And so it could result in some regulatory amendment package depending on what the Council does with that committee report.
Okay, I'll just see if there's any questions for you on that particular piece. No? Maybe, Chris, maybe if we just pause and just check on the agenda. Steve, we have time set aside for tomorrow from 9 till 10:30 to complete the reports for Alaska, right? And you're available tomorrow then to pick this up again, Chris and Dan?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And the National Marine Fisheries Service has a report as well, and then Scott Meyer, so I think in that hour and a half should be plenty of time.
That'll be enough? Okay. So then let's pause here on this particular item, and I'll just see if there's any comments that people in the audience want to make on any of the presentations they've heard this afternoon, or any questions for any of the presenters that occurred. I'm not seeing any, but Neil told me that he did have an answer for you on your question, and we could take that now, and then we could adjourn for this afternoon and then pick the remainder of the reports up for tomorrow. So thanks very much, Chris and Dan.
This should only take a minute, but Commissioner Benkin, you had asked about the proportion of catch that was covered by creel. It's one of the benefits of having staff not at the meeting, or they can do some work for you. The short answer, which is the quick and dirty, is that it's a minimum of 52%, but the actual number is higher. The reason the actual number is higher is that this is just a summary of the catch from areas where it's exclusively gathered from creel. The more difficult and time-consuming piece would be to break out the areas where we have a combination of tools that are generating the estimate, i.e. some of it coming from creel and some of it coming from logbook programs. So the actual number will be higher than that. If I were forced to give you a rough sense, I would say it's probably at least another 10 to 15% higher than that once we kind of broke out the areas that were a combination of creel and logbook programs. That's all. Thanks.
And that was for just overall, Neil, or for halibut in particular?
This is just halibut.
Okay. All right, thanks. Unless we have any other business, I think we would adjourn for this afternoon. We're back in the same room at 9 o'clock tomorrow to hear the rest of the presentations from Alaska. Did we want to have a further meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow to talk about what we're going to do for the remainder of the next couple of days? Are there any items that you wanted to bring forward?
I guess at some point I need a little more guidance on where in the process we want motions on some of these issues that we've just discussed.
Okay.
And I don't know whether that needs to happen at 8 in the morning or if we can do that at a break, but it would help me to know the process you want to follow.
Okay. Well, why don't we do that at 8 o'clock tomorrow? That would be a good time. Bob?
I want to make a motion under, I'm not sure what financial part that I need to make it under, so the staff to help me through that.
Okay. Do you want to do that now, or?
I can do that after the break.
Yeah.
But we could talk about where that comes up tomorrow.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. We're adjourned.